Okay, cool. Thank you everyone for being here. Are we okay with the door open, David, you think?
Open close, but I can.
Okay, I don't mind it's open. Be closer if it gets noisy. Yeah, welcome to the September edition of System Thinking Ontario. We had to move the day of the week around, because there's like for our guests, but also there's a lot of changes in the semester's timing of when the courses are. A lot of them are in the evenings now. So we just changed things around, but thank you for accommodating and being here. Usually when we start System Thinking Ontario, we just go around in a circle and we just introduce ourselves, just say our name, and what brought us here tonight. I'll just start. My name is Zaid Khan. I host, co-host and organize System Thinking Ontario, and I'm really interested in hearing about this topic about quantitative history. We're gonna come back to, if you're co-discussing, I'll come to you at the end, but maybe why don't we almost say far.
Okay, hi, I'm Kelly Rivera. I don't know, I'm happy to be here.
Cool.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Roberto. I'm a current SFI student in my MRP, and I love the idea of quantifying history. I love all systems, so.
Here it is.
So hi everyone, I'm Ali. Marcel is a alum of SFI. Tell me about this event, and I thought the topic was super interesting.
Hi everyone, my name is Marcel. I just graduated SoDy 2 months ago. Yeah, I think the topic is really interesting. We hear the term unprecedented a lot, and it does feel unprecedented as we're living in the moment, but I think it's important to have the firm memory of what has happened and that there are cycles. So I'm excited to learn more.
Hi everyone, I'm not usually here. My name is Marla. I'm here this week. I'm usually in Calgary. I'm here visiting and expanding my network and remembering that the echo chamber of what you get in Western Canada is not the same as the rest of the country. Super interested in what the topic is, and I heard about it circuitously, so.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Emma with extremely long last name. I'm also in the SFI, but it's true. My last name is Computational. I could spell it. There are extra letters in there. It's much shorter, actually. Anyway, I'm also an SFI student, but actually I'm also Foresight. I got into Foresight in the corporate world. I'm founder of the Canadian Foresight Network, and I am a fan of some of the work that is being done and some of the thought leadership. So yeah, I was not going to miss it. I might be also the reason why some of the meetings got long, but I think it was worth it. So.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Scarsone. I am a third year part-time SFI embarking on MRP person. I like history. I have a background in Egyptology and museums, and I think systems are the way to be. So I'm happy to be here.
I'm a classmate of Giovanna's, Roxana Pacharka. So I'm also in my thesis year in the Strategic Foresight and Innovation Program. I'm interested in systems and history, so yeah, here to learn, listen.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a legal professional, but I did a degree in history, European history. I'm pretty new to this city, so this is definitely unprecedented for me.
Yeah.
Awesome.
We'll go David, and then I'll have the co-discussants.
David Aiden, now a adjunct professor in systems thinking, trying to figure out what the Foresight people do.
Cool. Yeah, so we have two co-discussants, Neal and Daniel. Thank you both for being here. Maybe you can both share a brief bit about yourselves, and then I'll kick us off with like an exploratory kickoff question.
Sure. I'm Neal. I'm a design lead. So I'm a designer by trade at an industrial company. But when I took SFI here, my MRP was on cycles of innovation through history, so that they could help you understand what's happened in finance, in innovation cycles, so you can do better foresight work. And I was concentrating on regional centers of innovation and how industrial clusters can take up cycles of history and using them along with strategic frameworks and what's called cluster theory, like industrial cluster theory, to build better regions that survive longer. So yeah, very excited to be here.
Thank you for being here.
I'm Dan, I'm a computational historian, which just means I'm a historian, but I'm not afraid of spreadsheets. I was invited to speak my thought, and very happy to be here, mostly just to know that there's a group of people in Toronto who are nerd out about systems thinking, which is always fun. So my here, my work has been working with the Seshat Databank, which we'll talk about, which is a sort of large international project to treat history like a science and sort of treat it quantitatively, but also still keep the qualitative nuance part. And how do we do that? How do we build data? How do we analyze things? How do we find the patterns in the cycles? And more recently with my new organization, which is representing my teacher, really interested in trying to figure out if there are sort of lessons in all that and understanding these broad patterns and understanding these dynamics that can help us navigate what we're going through now. I think there are. It's sort of a matter of how do you do it? How do you have those conversations? How do you bring in the historical perspective to other types of design, whether it's corporate, finance, or ecology, or whatever it happens to be. And sort of our saying now is challenges we're facing are wholly novel, but also entirely familiar. And that's kind of a contradiction that I'm trying to hold and keep with and use systems thinking to help navigate that space. That both of those things can be true. So really eager to hear everyone's thoughts about that.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you both for agreeing to do this. And for those that are new to this format, we just kind of kick it off with a couple of questions, have the two discussants share a little bit, and then honestly, it just spirals and goes wherever it needs to go. Okay. We just finished introductions. All we did was say our name and what brought us here tonight. We would love to hear from you.
My name is Kevin, and I was at the vocab, like API for that.
Oh, okay.
Like a couple weekends ago.
Cool.
I want to learn more.
Awesome. Welcome. Yeah, thanks for being here. So, and Neal, because you're MRP focused a little bit, like I'll play to.
Really quick, just for the new people.
Oh yeah, MRP major research project is the equivalent of
So like a
that
thesis.
thesis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is
Okay,
okay, now
Isn't the equivalent thesis? Let's say something.
What?
MRP is the equivalent of a thesis?
It would be if you had better supervisors.
Oh.
This is being recorded.
So there's a story there, we'll get into that.
So Dan or Dan? You don't.
I go again mostly.
You go by Dan. Okay, so why don't you give us a little introductory
Yeah.
flavor? What is this idea of computational history? Where did this term come from? Why is it even a thing? And then we can unpack it a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We would say it's weird that it hadn't been a thing before. It's odd that it took so long. So let me just sort of really quickly give you my kind of personal journey into it by way of explaining what this is. So 2008, Peter Turchin, who's a ecologist, evolutionary biologist and ecologist by training, writes this article in Nature that nobody reads, nobody cares about, and he basically declares that he figured out, evolutionary theory and formalized population cycles and blah, 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 did all the stuff. And then he turned his attention to human society. He just realized that, the math, the models, the insights he brought to like literally tracking beetle populations in Louisiana swamps, which is what he did in his dissertation. He's like, the same things happen among humans. It's a little more complicated. It's hard to wrap your head around it, but the same issues, the same processes seem to bear out. Therefore, we should be able to use the same methods to uncover them. And he just sort of declared, okay, we're going to treat history like a science, like any other science, data, hypotheses, testing, analyses, stats, whatever. Okay, nobody cared, except for a couple of people who we happened to meet who said, oh, this is really interesting. I have some big picture questions about broad scale social evolution, cultural evolution, things about why do the first societies form, why things tend to get bigger, why populations rise and fall, why are religions such an important part of this picture, how do they fit in, all these like big questions. And in about 2011, they formed the Seshat Global History Databank, which is just a project to say, we're going to gather as much as we can information about as many different past societies as we can, turn it into like actual data, like numbers, subject those numbers to these evolutionary models that Peter had been developing in order to answer these big questions like population cycles, what do they have? Okay, great. Meanwhile, I'm a graduate student in studying the ancient Roman Empire, and I'm getting increasingly interested in the bigger picture, the broader perspective, comparing, looking outside of the Mediterranean, what's going on in other parts of the world, other time periods, also deeply in some quantitative methods. So I encountered Peter's work. When I'm graduating, they just got a big grant to pursue this data bank project. And so they hired me as a postdoc, and that was 2014, and I just kind of never left, I just loved it. So we, a couple of other postdocs, a couple of other professors, we just went to the task of going through sources. How are we going to look at all this historical writing? We're talking to literally hundreds of professors, expert historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, to try to compile this database. Are we doing it right? What are we missing? How do we capture nuance? How do we capture controversies and conflict among scholars? All these different things. And it was only in 2018 that we wrote our first big analytic article, and they started in 2011, took 7 years to get a critical mass of data. Since then, the pace has sort of quickened now that we've sort of figured out. But that's all that, when we talk about paleodynamics, when we talk about computational history, that's it. It's deceptively simple. It's really hard to do in practice, but the method is really simple. It's, if you have a idea, a theory, a hypothesis about what drives the things we've observed in the past and present, you should be able to subject it to the scientific method, just like anything else. It's just like weather forecasting. It's just like ecological evolution. It's just like biological evolution. It's all the same kinds of dynamics, and therefore the same kinds of approaches and models can be brought to bear. And that's what we've been doing, and sort of publishing articles exploring different questions based on this data.
Okay, fascinating. 7 years to collect the data and then.
And I mean, we still collect it as we go, but
Yeah.
there's now like a body that we can
Right.
keep scrutinizing.
So holding that explanation, Neal, maybe you just want to come in and share your, both, I mean, you work in a professional capacity in some ways, but also you have a personal interest in history. I mean, I know that because we jam a lot. Maybe you just want to share how you kind of came to this topic of cyclical history.
Yeah, like everything that I would ever have to say about cyclical history and this topic, it's all wrapped up in my MRP. So unlike you, I haven't been able to bring it to a wider audience, but the interest is still there. So I'm so delighted to be invited. When it came time to write an MRP, I kind of knew that I wanted to do something about history, and the principal advisor, Peter Jones, was very quick to say, yes, history and historical cycles should be used for foresight work. And he may have said something like there hasn't been a thesis or MRP written about it. Yeah, or maybe there has, but he said there's room for a really good one to be written. And so he began talking about his time in Dayton, Ohio, where he grew up, and how it was a really powerful regional center of innovation. It was considered a town that was like the factory of the world. It had multiple powerful, important factories with hundreds and thousands of people working at them all. It was an area where they had more General Motors workers than anywhere else, apart from the General Motors factory in Detroit. They did all kinds of things. Delco came from Dayton. And he said, why don't you look at cities like Dayton and try and track their rise and their fruition as regional centers of innovation? What did the peak period look like? And then how did it decline? And then he said, try and look at the science of cycles of finance and innovation. He started to name a few. One of them was called the Convertive cycle of innovation. That looks at investments in innovation, I believe. Then he said you could look at things like Elliott waves, which are more about how people behave in cycles of finance. And then you could look at something that's called the fourth turning, which is what do generations of different people look like and how do they react to big shifts in society or disasters and things like that. And when I started to look at them all, I began to lay one cycle below the other, and stock market cycles as well. And we started to look at what it would look like if you look at all these cycles together over, say, a 200-year period. And then I began to look at things like, I started to bring in the kinds of things that were taught at SFI, such as strategic frameworks that companies could use, but also regions might be able to use. I found something called the GEMS theory, which is for looking at the different components of regional innovation success, how that could be kept healthy. And then maybe just one more thing would be in case studies. Dayton, I looked at Hartford, Connecticut. I looked at Detroit for sure. And I put them all together in one big MRP and came up with some conclusions about how you could compile looking at cycles of innovation, use strategic frameworks, including things like the three horizons to bring people together so you could point them to a better future, and how a region could use all of them to try and make their larger region and groups of companies healthier. So that was my MRP.
Yes, it's fascinating. If you have a chance to check it out, highly recommend doing so. The title of it, Neil? The title is.
Do you remember the title? Oh, yeah, well, do you remember the
It
year?
was a big, long title. Basically, it was like mapping historical cycles of innovation through history.
It's linked on the event, one, so if you just trace it back, you'll find it.
Okay.
But so appreciate you both sharing how you're coming to the topic, and maybe just to kick us off on some of the unpacking some of that. Dan, do you want to just repeat what that tension is that you're holding? It's like understanding some of the examples from the past while the unpredictability of where we are in the present.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe you want to unpack that.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, love to get into it, and would love to get more into cycles, the science of cycles, as you say, were super fascinating, countering Kardashev and turning and really interesting. The Three Horizons framework.
I suggest if you want to go there, go for it. You can talk about the different cycles too.
Oh, no, I mean, well, we'll talk about it. But to answer your actual question, so I don't know if everyone or anyone is familiar with the term polycrisis. This is becoming a thing. So I'm engaged with the polycrisis crowd through various channels that we can get into, networks and organizations, whatever. So one of the things that comes out a lot in that space when I'm usually being a kind of historian, for good reason, it's not a history thing. Talk about, okay, polycrisis as interconnection of deeply entangled systemic dysfunctions. Bad shit is happening in many different areas all at once, and they're feeding off of each other. And it's ecological degradation and environmental threats and social dysfunction, economic decline, and all the things. And one of the things that I sort of say in this space, which is difficult to articulate because it doesn't quite make sense until you think about it, and then it does, is there are certain aspects of our modern world or modern polycrisis that have never existed in human history before, period, full stop. Anthropogenic climate change being irreversible, being what it is, that's new, that's real new. How really deeply embedded some of our systems are, communication systems or economic systems, they are really globally entangled in a meaningful way. It's never been truly global, this level of interconnection. However, almost everything else is really, really familiar and common. Having, continental-wide entanglement, absolutely, that's happened in the past. It's not been truly global, but it's been beyond society. So there's some similarities there. And even though the type and the scope of climate change that we're experiencing is very novel, the manifestations of it, the ecological threats, the, increasing uncertainty, the increasing hecticness of ecological disasters, hurricanes, flooding, droughts, all these things. There have been periods in the past where that has been particularly acute as well in different regions, right? So there's been, on the ground, it doesn't look that different if you're in the Little Ice Age and you're experiencing, a bunch of droughts and famines in a few decades versus, well, we're in global warming and so we're experiencing a bunch of droughts and famines in a few decades. It's a little bit different, but like, it's also kind of familiar, it's kind of similar. And then a lot of the social pressures and the economic pressures and the cultural pressures, those are very common and repetitive. And we see them in a cyclical kind of nature. This is where I think it links into these sorts of cycles. That's happened 200 years in the past, thousands of years in the past. Everywhere we look, we see those sorts of pressures. And we're experiencing them again today. And so there is a lot of overlap, there is a lot of rhyming. And therefore, I think there's a lot to be learned from exploring how it has worked in the past, as long as we acknowledge that it is not the same, it's similar, it's not the same. And any solution, any ideas, any insights we gain have to be recontextualized for what is novel about that moment. And so that's the tension. So
Yes.
it's both, it's totally new and it's totally not. And it's hard to deal with.
Representative of our time.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Neil, any comments before we open it up?
Sure, yeah, polycrisis, when I was looking over my notes for the past few nights on what I had wrote. It didn't, the word polycrisis didn't come up. The only thing that would come up is like X events, which is more singular. And what you're saying rings true more for what's happening right now. It does seem a little bit connected with the kind of things I've been reading from Ray Dalio, because he has he's the guy who owns, it's called Bridgewater Investments. And he's been in the news the past couple of years talking about cycles of innovation and how he's been using them since the 1970s to try and understand what's going to happen in the financial world. And he has a number of graphs and things that seem to reflect more of a polycrisis, empires rising and falling mixed with cycles of, debt. And he'll have them intertwining. And when he's talking about, countries in rise and fall, he may say, well, where the graphs cross might be war.
Yeah.
But that's just one variable in a way, the rise and fall of countries. So polycrisis is very intriguing.
Yeah. And so let me sort of, if I can, just to get into the cycles thing, and I think this is really bringing it back as well to complexity science and systems thinking and how this all works is, like the cycles is so important to understand, to diagnose, to document. Oh, these things are recurrent, these things happen to have this sort of lifespan, whether it's debt cycles or innovation cycles or bubble and burst cycles, population cycles, whatever it happens to be. Those are the two points that we try to bring, especially from the crew dynamics lens, is you need to know the cycles, you need to know what happens, but you can't just be sort of passive about them too. And this is where people like Warren Buffett, Dalio, Peter Thiel, and all these like Richard Jews who are in the news who like kind of use this to their advantage. You can sort of document it, see it kind of coming, and play the market with it. Or you can try to do something about it. And these cycles are not set in stone. And even as clear and empirical the patterns are, whether it's Kardashev waves or fourth turning kind of things, it's not exact. It's not like, oh, every 25 years this exactly happens. Well, it's kind of 20 years then, and then it's 26 years then, and then this one is a little more dramatic, and that peak in the cycle is a little less high. It's still a cycle, right? It still is an empirical pattern. It's more similar than it is different. It's not exactly the same. And sort of to me, what that shows is that there is room to maneuver, right? It's not set in stone. The cycles are in a way phenomenal of the underlying dynamics and the underlying drivers, right? It's not that, debt rises and falls just because it does. It's not that there is, civil order and then civil disobedience every 50 or so years. just because it's driven by structures and factors and forces, inequality, immiseration, you know, elite competition, all various things that happen to keep coming into being, and therefore they keep producing the same kind of outcomes. And so it looks like cycles, and it is cycles, but it's because of real things that are causing them. And so if you tie the diagnosis of cycles with a causal mechanistic analysis of why it happens, then you can start into the world of something like three horizons and say, okay, well, what if we want a different outcome? Then we have to deal with the drivers, and you have to understand that. And that's why cycles can be useful once they point you to the causal forces behind them that you can then actually intervene in. That's getting into policy, that's getting into design. And then it's really hard to do because, as you say, it's never one thing, it's multiple variables. And the dynamics, the cycles, the timescales are often different. And so it's, you know, three different forces that operate on the order of a community or years or businesses, whatever, that conspire over time to produce what looks like a 25-year cycle. And so that's a complex systems dynamics issue, is understanding the interplay between dynamic forces that operate at different spatial and temporal scales. That's the formal way to say it. We can unpack what that actually looks like in practice. But that's why it's so important to do that and why it's so hard to do that. And that's like, it's sort of like that's our thing. Okay, well, let's identify the things from the past, let's build some kind of causal models. But if you want to think about, okay, well, what can we do about it when we're seeing these patterns occurring right now that we don't want? Then we got to intervene in the system, and then you want to know what that system is.
Yeah,
Pretty hard.
I think that message of tying your diagnosis to the causal drivers would resonate strongly with a lot of folks.
It's not the force that you got there.
So speaking of which, why don't we open it up for any comments or conversation points? Dynamically expanding the circle.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where we're going with that.
You're always scaling up.
Yeah, exactly.
Austin Tuchin talks about flattening the curve, right? During the crisis, he says that their path towards crisis is the same, but the outcomes, to his point, could be different, and there's the points of intervention. The flattening of the curve, and maybe I just have that part of in my readings. Do we have any successful stories of where that happened? And it feels like we are the very much peak of that wonderful curve across the world, right? Sort of one and two, maybe both of your thoughts on the who should be in charge, right? We talk about the policy interventions at the city government organizational level, but because they're so intertwined, there needs to be multiple people in charge, and maybe they're not just two groups of politicians.
Yes, that's a great question. So we actually just published a week or two ago a piece called Crises Averted, I think. And send it if anyone's interested, but it is exactly a handful of examples of from our data set of we have like 180 crises of specific past societies that we looked at and trying to explore this and why does some get really bad, what does some get what's bad. So this is like 4 examples where a crisis was brewing and all the normal stresses and pressures were there, but it ended up with what we would call progressive adaptive kind of reform. So Chartist period is mid-19th century England is one example. The progressive era through the New Deal stuff in the US is a good example of this. There's a couple of others, and you know, they're not perfect. Again, there's not everything that like 19th century England does is great. They did a lot of horrible stuff. This is a genocidal, colonial, imperial machine. But domestically in England, they did some stuff that we want to do as well. Like this is when we think of modern nation states and welfare states and social public goods, a lot of that was born in mid-19th century developments, including in this period.
My understanding is that England avoided riots, whereas the rest of Europe, we're talking like 1848,
Yeah.
went to the streets and there was bloodshed.
Yeah. And so we try to unpack for people, what did they do that France didn't do, that, Weimar Republic didn't do, that Vienna didn't, like all, that Hungary didn't do. Why does England look a little different than everywhere else? And this is a big part of that early modern Western moment. We can get into that. But so we're hunting for those sorts of examples. And again, it's not just keeping exactly what they did, you do now, but there are some principles about, increasing protections for workers, increasing suffrage, increasing inclusion, the political, like all these good things that we want they didn't. So how do we do that? But this brings you to the next one, which I think is absolutely essential. Because it's so complicated, because it's so multifaceted, you're absolutely right. It has to be sort of an inclusive, deliberative, co-creating kind of thing, and that's part of the solution is tweaking, reforming, overhauling, whatever it needs of our political process, so that it is bringing in enough voices that all of the things are being considered. That's the real trick of how to do that. Yeah.
Issue solved, then we can.
No, there are elites, right, and there were other rising elites that fight each other, so what do you do with that, right, because they are the ones that are in charge of the decision making.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, one of the lessons I'm coming to in all this historical work is, because there are power holders, who by definition have more sway than non-power holders. They exist, full stop, that's the reality. So either they're with you and helping to support the kind of reforms that you need, which happened in 1840s England, which happened a couple of other, like we can document times where that happens. Actually, all reforms where that happens, sometimes it's the kind of reforms we want. Or they work against it, and that's when things tend to really spiral into animosity and violence, and don't always necessarily result in positive adaptations. So, it's about that kind of consilience building, I would say, which is not easy and not in this political environment. It's not what people want to hear, but I think that's one of the things that history shows. I really should hear thoughts on that. Bringing in people who may, even just in the corporate environment, bringing in people who may not be immediately receptive to.
I've been thinking for a few minutes about, if you take a Ray Dalio, one of the first things, reading an article about how he used a cycle, it basically just said, he used it to avoid problems for his company in 2008.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice, but it's a bit monodimensional, that's what you could really do. I think I appreciate that he's making visible all different kinds of charts and graphs. But what I kind of take from it is these kinds of charts and graphs and science, to the extent that his type of charts and graphs or science can be used by people to make a more human future. So they're used by the rich right now, certain 2025, but they could be used by maybe like I was saying earlier, regions that want to be more healthy, or other macro groups of people and societies.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, that's part of the answer of, you think you can use this for your own personal advantage, but that's harder and harder in a public crisis environment. And so maybe this is sort of one of my hopes, is that, well, maybe by exposing that, no matter how rich and well-positioned you are, you're not gonna make it through it without looking after everybody.
Yeah,
And that's some kind of stability.
Rick Dalio in his article does, one of the graphs is about, we're not going to be able to do this if people can get along.
Yeah.
So he does have that metric.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and I can ask about 1,000 questions, but moving on to bring up my own career history is complicated because there are a lot of different areas, including epidemiology and public health for a while. And one of the people that I hang out with are those who have looked at massive changes, as adverse changes in health as leading indicators of socio-political collapse. For example, the diseases that just rose in the Soviet Union prior to, not following, but prior to the collapse, and are looking at states very carefully right now and are predicting we're going to see our first case of polio there very soon. We're going to see diphtheria outbreaks from cholera. But I'm curious if health data sets were some, like, I can't even imagine where you got the data, but was that some of what you?
Oh, yeah, that's, we've done concerted, time-consuming, costly efforts to try to get that data for a number of ancient societies. The biological well-being is what we sort of lump all that into. Such an important indicator. It's hard to get, but when you do, it is always interesting and useful. So even like, 2017, 2018, we were publishing about, we're trying to track like life expectancy, we're trying to track average height, whatever. And these things, I can't remember exactly when it was 2018 that for the first time in like 80 years or so, average heights and life expectancy overall in the US started to dip. And we're like, oh shit, that's a thing. And it's exactly that kind of stuff. And the disease prevalence and different sorts of, the like lifestyle diseases, the diseases that are preventable by infrastructure, that can be a sign that, if they show up, it means the infrastructure isn't there. Deaths of despair is also a big leading indicator of general unrest. And so this is, I can't remember who, some other group came up with this metric. It's suicides and overdoses, and sort of lump these together and track them as this indicator. That seems to be a good, leading sign.
Pretty solid
Distress. Yeah.
Because it could have meaning about how societies handle a big macro event or, polycrisis. Like I remember reading that just prior to World War II, the teenagers in the Great Depression, they were actually kind of malnourished, and society actually thought of them as kind of layabouts and lazy at the time, but they went on to be, America's heroes in World War II, in spite of the health crisis that must have been present in the 1930s. But that's only one example.
But that's a great example because, the reason that happens is there's enough recognition and urgency with looming international crises even in the 1930s. That's the nuclear, right? Like it's not for nothing that didn't just happen. There was major concerted efforts. There was a growing of the political apparatus just to look after that generation. By Roosevelt building on progressive era reforms, and I think it's one of the clearest examples of when the will is there, when the ability to act collectively and that sort of cohesion is there, you can get a lot done. It can go, you can do so good as possible. This is the only reason I can sleep at night. Those kinds of thoughts. Yeah, and you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not fully formed. Actually, but my approach or my kind of into history is through gender equality and just trying to understand where the patriarchy started from, but also what existed before that, and this idea that pre-agrarian societies were more egalitarian than what we have now, and also the connection to the connection of the initial hypothesis that started this whole thing about us being the same as the Beatles. Like there is this human nature that pushes us to kind of produce these cycles. But I feel like I wonder if there's any data from back like pre-agrarian history societies that were completely different in like the values. The value system that they kind of build their society on, and then just us looking at gender equality as one of the values. Like, is there enough data, or is there any data to kind of contrast that society from what we have right now, and also like the types of issues of the poly crisis that is shaping today? to be a result of the value system that we have, the human nature that's kind of pushing that. And also, yeah, I don't know if there's a question there, but I guess, and also like in our SFI kind of conversations, we always contrast, you know, the Western society to like indigenous societies and their way of being and how we're trying to bring that back in a healthy and active and like relational way so that we are able to move away from the crisis that we've created as a result of, again, the thing that connects it all is the value system, and I don't know if there's enough to be able to contrast that.
Yeah, it is tricky, and it's something that some of my colleagues definitely looking into. I would recommend, my friend, Luke Camp just published a book, which you've probably heard, absolutely, read it, get it, it's very long. Goliath's curse, and it's.
Let's bring him in. Let's bring him in, by the way.
Sure, yeah. I know he's on the tour right now. So I mean, so that's one of the things that he wants to do is corral exactly that kind of evidence. It's a little tricky, but there does seem to be, indications that smaller scale, less agrarian that you get, there seems to be less hybridization. You know, some of the smaller scale societies, indigenous societies around the world that we know of, there's matriarchal societies, there's definitely very different gender relations, political relations, different economic relations. It's, you know, there are even among complex, modernish, agrarian societies, there's vast differences in how unequal, how much injustice is sort of tolerated. So there's still a range, like it's not, all the pre-agrarian societies are this and all the post is that. It's a little more dynamic. The other thing that, we will say in terms of the human nature, the commonalities is, even small scale, pre-agrarian, indigenous societies are subject to many of the same forces. You've seen collapse, you've seen population declines, you see diseases, you see conflict. It may be a little less, lower scale, but it still happen. I don't know, human nature is maybe not the right word for it, but there are common pressures, no matter what your scale, no matter what your value system is. To me, I think you're exactly right, like it's, we got ourselves into this mess, right? It just happened to us. It's the result of our actions, it's the result of our systems, which are the result of our value systems. But what I see when you look at history, there's no such thing as human nature in the sense that everything is malleable. We can change, we have done things differently, therefore we can do things differently again against the hope that I take to it. And it's one of the things I like about history is it does provide enough examples of difference that you can hang your hat on and say, well, it doesn't have to be this way. Everything we identify that we don't like. I'm actually really interested in all of your perspectives on this from the sort of foresight perspective, the foresight where like how do you make that connection between the imagined futures that we want and the reality we face? And is there a role in the past? Is there a role in this kind of complex dynamics and sort of cyclical understanding? Is this something you guys engage in, want to engage in, you're interested in? Takes.
I was gonna say it's totally up to debate, even in foresight, right? Because it depends on what flavor of foresight you're talking about, right? Because depending which flavor, and I'm still new here, we're still not understanding, but since I'm still a student, I still joke like that, but from my understanding, it's like, yeah, we have similar frameworks, but how those frameworks are applied, there's in the foresight world, like the anticipatory framework, which is really interesting and like, comes from systems, has its own, I would say, issues and follow through, right? In terms of like, okay, so we need reflections of ourself in the future in order to actually create a full model of myself that works computationally. So it's like, data things like far better than that, in terms of like how we'll be able to create functional models of life from a computational perspective, but you weren't able to actually to do so until the DNA had a reflection of itself in terms of its output, how the cell would actually create itself, which is true, and there's a lot of science on that, but foresight is kind of looking at that and whether or not preferred future is viable. Like, is a preferred future a dangerous thing? Because without, so there is an interesting battle, I don't want to say battle, but like a conversation happening within foresight of like, we can have, okay, here's a really interesting like thing that's going on behind the scenes, which is what signals are the most relevant? Same thing as you, but from a different perspective. So when we look at weak signals, when we look at those like edge cases that might just pass through everything single system and like light everything else up on fire, what are the most relevant? How do we detect them? And should we even look at preferred features at that point? Right, to try to nudge things. Is the purpose of foresight to convince people? Is the purpose of foresight to strategically like help us along to flatten the curve or flatten whatever they might be? So it's just perspective thing, but that's my take at least. Which is interesting to see which way you're kind of looking at it. Wow, I don't know how it feels.
I remember, after I graduated and Zaid and I and others, in my memory began talking about systems that preferred futures and goals and things like that was more of the purview of CEOs and things like that, whereas we should be looking, not like a arrow pointed at some kind of goal, and therefore is kind of calcified maybe as a future. Yeah, but something different. A little more motion.
Yeah. I see you're trying to direct the future of this conversation to our futures, where we're more looking to computational history, so it's like, I don't know.
There's no difference.
I don't know if there's any other, like, I might just play, I'm gonna go back and play the contrarian to what you're suggesting. Both of you actually in a way. Okay, great, Dan, you have all this data and you can look at the history, awesome. But as you said, there are some things that truly are unprecedented, like, and one of the main ones to me personally that I'm observing is there hasn't been a reference in time where everyone is carrying the world's information on themselves. So if a pebble moves in Sri Lanka, you know about it, right? Like, and so no matter what diagnosis you have, penetrating that media mentality of an entire globally minded individual is truly unprecedented. So even the result of crisis fatigue is potentially downstream of a media ecology of surrounded by that. So wonderful that you discovered it, but too late. We're media consumed, and it's not going to penetrate our bubble.
Yeah, that's real, that's a danger, but this is the problem with that tension of, well, how.
I don't actually believe that, just think.
Yeah, but like how significant are the differences, are the differences in the units so different that there's nothing to be gained from the parts that are similar? I don't think so. I'd also say the demonstration that what you just described, that sort of fatigue and just information overload where you can't accept it. That is not the case demonstrably because jerks like me get to exist in these spaces and get to have the ear of people in sort of the polyversus world, and there is reception to it. It's not everybody, but it is possible. Again, if there is one, like regardless of the specific repeating patterns, although, you know, no matter what's new, no matter information, communications, environmental, whatever climate that you want to point to, that's totally different. So much of what we're facing and so much of what we're talking about are inequalities, the structural deficits, the dysfunctions in our political democratic systems. Those I got nothing.
Right.
That was from history there. So at minimum, there is something we need to address there, where our previous experience is relevant at minimum.
Right. So the receptivity of quantitative history is one representation of that take up, and two is that there's structural issues that resonate through time, and so you can still learn from those, even if the particulars have shifted.
Yeah.
Do you think cycles of all types across the board quicken over time as a rule? Which also makes it more difficult to make sense.
Not necessarily often, just about like, the ones that are very observable are the economic and the technological ones, and those have tended to, I think,
Yeah.
pick up a little bit, but some of the cycles have slowed. Disease spread cycles have actually kind of slowed as a result of some technology and some of the biomedical advances. Like those, major regional pandemic they were more common, more quick, I would say, generally, than they are. I know that doesn't sound right in 2025, but it is actually true.
Well, I'm sure the 1918 pandemic, it spread pretty quickly. All it takes is a few ships.
Yeah.
Whereas the pandemic a few years ago, it was an airplane, but it's not exactly.
Yeah, but that's over 100 years of a globally interconnected system. There should have been more, right?
Yeah.
And in the past, again, it's not global, but in the past regionally, like even you think of I think there's a common misconception about the Black Death. That was not a thing. That was a bunch of recurrent cycles and re-cycles of pandemic across Eurasia for a century. And it just kept going again and again and again. And
Quite rapid.
Really rapid, really, again, spread really quickly. So anyway, so that's a slowing cycle, it's an example of a slowing cycle. The thing that scares me the most is this is a polycrisis thing. Because so much of our systems are global and entangled, it's this is the thing that you observed, it's the synchronization of many of the cycles. That's hard to deal with, and that's a little bit, like there's sort of nowhere to escape. And in the past, you could say, well, maybe this region, a bunch of these societies are experiencing crisis and decline and warfare, whatever. But over there, they're okay and everything's fine, and maybe there's a way to balance down, or maybe they can provide an escape, or they can provide, they have a surplus of food, there's a drought over here.
Yeah.
So that's something. If your cycles are all lined up, just everyone's going through the same thing at the same time, that's tricky.
And like, how do you make sense of them if they're not sufficiently visualized
Yeah.
all at once? I tried by putting them all in a vertical row. You could have transparencies, but if you're in front of some kind of board, a region or a company or something like that, and you have a lot to communicate about a whole bunch of different cycles, a person has to think about how you're gonna show it visually. You don't wanna have one cycle about health and then you have to walk across the room to get another cycle of finance, and one will be lost. You kind of need to see them play with each other. It's very difficult. It's a lot of ink or a lot of pixels.
Yeah. If you can crack that, let me know. That would be struggling with that as well. So hard. And this goes back to your point, like, you can't do everything at once. There's just too, this is the nature of complexity of science. It's complex, right? There's a lot. It's often, and if you're trying to convince people, trying to talk to people who aren't used to that language, it can be tricky to convey all the information you want. And I don't think any one person can do it, and no one audience is sufficient. It has to be multiple, iterative, connected. I don't know exactly how that works, but it can't just be a one-off, me talking to a CEO and they're done, right? It has to be a bunch of people talking to a bunch of people, and then there's a collective intelligence is not the case.
Yeah, it has to be common societal knowledge that things come in waves and that people should have access to seeing them somewhere.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the more, and this is an education thing too, like teaching complexity, thinking in language earlier on, just to get us used to it, thinking about like the way we teach probability is really shitty. There's just a lot of things that are kind of not naturally as sort of humans, we're predisposed not to be great at. And I don't think we do a great job early on teaching them. I think that
Explaining systems. Like that.
Where's this week's people? Go ahead.
Oh, so.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, then, I'll go about it.
I also don't have a fully formed question, but there were a few mentions of
sort of underlying these cycles, for example, there's some underlying mechanistic concept that might explain what's happening. There's a concept of cycles speeding up, slowing down, also due to some mechanistic reasoning technology, you know, one of them. I was wondering if you could say more about that. Are there some very clear takeaways that most people don't think about, or something that's obvious when you look at history more than are just sort of daily knowledge of history? That sort of stand out as things. And the other side of the question was, in particular, in terms of economics and inequality.
Yeah.
And gender is a part of that, but also just generally inequality, you know, wealth status. Is there, when we all think about the world and history, I think it's very easy, like for myself, not knowing about history, to put yourself in your kind of own world that you into this lens of, oh, if it was 18, whatever, what would it look like? But are there things that we should think about that we don't, that we kind of take for granted or no longer here? Slavery, maybe an example, or something else that totally changes how we should completely imagine the concept of what life was actually like back then. Like if you think about equality or inequality today, the range of that, again, I don't know, but I'm guessing is like compressed to this much inequality versus how much inequality there probably was in some past times. Is it like, is there maybe something that's not a cycle, but something like equality? It actually has been always interesting where, like we often say, oh, the good old days or something like that, make America great again.
Yeah.
Is that a real thing, or is that like a complete wrong perception?
Well,
The arc of justice.
yeah, that's very good. Oh, that's such a big question. I don't know if I have an answer to it. There's nothing I can think of, and I've encountered, don't hold me to this, but I don't think there's anything that's unidirectional in either way, good or bad, including things like inequality. Yeah, in some respects, some structural aspects of inequality are shrunk. But, you know, some wealth inequalities as bad as this country ever been. Certain structural inequalities, slavery, human sacrifice, there's major things, those don't exist anymore, so that's a win. On the other hand, you could argue that, there is significant lack of, bodily freedom and lack of individual sovereignty for political and economic reasons, that is akin to slavery. And so it's maybe not as far as you would say. And again, coming back to your question, arguably, we have been decreasing in our equality, in our, both economically, but both materially and structurally, politically, socially, in our values, in our inclusion of different voices of age and gender and different ethnic and whatever. Arguably, that's been a long, slow decline. But again, with ups and downs, this is sort of what I always come back to is, you know, history looks more cyclical than it looks like a line in no matter what dimension you're looking at.
On the technology side, could you?
Even technology technology goes a little more back and forth than we think. Certain communications technologies, if you take the big picture view, of course, we can communicate much faster, much widely, we can hold a lot more information. But there are also plenty of examples of technology loss. There's plenty of
Greek
examples
fire,
of. Sorry?
Greek fire, for example, they don't know how they made it, right?
Yeah.
Greek fire, just.
Yeah, and even, you know, lost and then regained or shifted or co-opted or translated across, like, it's not quite as forward.
One example that is cycles of technology is people's experience of technology. Like right now, there seems to be more and more troubled minds and even discussed over AI. It seems to be ramping up. This would be a very quick technology cycle perhaps. But I'm thinking about, you know, that in comparison to the advent of technologies like the automobile, that people were they were able to find quicker use for it. They were more likely to pay money for its use. So I think that's an example of technology doesn't necessarily become people, but yeah, people's experience of technology isn't this upward, continuous, positive thing.
I wonder if you could comment on the role of disruptive events. The First World War is considered to have been precipitated, although I don't think you could say caused, by the assassination of the Archduke. And we're seeing that now. We had another political assassination today in the States, following a couple of legislators that were killed last month. And I don't know if there's any kind of a tipping point or an effect on cycles where it would reverse them or flatten them. Have you run into any of the responses to disruptive events like that?
Yeah. I have some thoughts.
You first, I'm trying to formulate something.
Well, so, I mean, it's really important, I think it goes back to, why it is so hard to do foresight, to do forecasting, to do this sort of thing, because there are forces that operate at different scales, and a disruptive event, the way we kind of think about it historically, in polycrisis context as well, is it's a sort of an acute thing. It happens in a moment, in a day, it sort of seems sudden. It's like a shock, right? Like an ecological shock, political assassination counts as one of these shocks. The sort of analogy that we've always used historically is, it's like a forest fire, right? Forest fire can be caused, precipitated by lightning striking a tree. But not every lightning strike leads to a forest fire, right? The underlying conditions, which are much longer term, which are much broader, matter, right? How the wind's flowing, has it been dry, has it been raining, what's this? All of these sort of what we would call historical dynamic forces shape the context within which the lightning strike has consequence. And so that's the thing with these kind of tipping points, right? There's assassinations, there's violence all the time. Sometimes it leads to a world war, sometimes it doesn't. And it's a little chaotic, it's hard to really pinpoint, but you know, in World War I, the conditions were in place, and then there is this sort of, you know, precipitating incident. Arguably, conditions are in place in a place like the US right now, which is why we starting to see a ramping up of this type of violence, like this is. The one shot can lead to another, because the context is there, that's very scary. But I think you're exactly right, and I think it's the multi-level, multi-scale-ness that to wrap our heads around. And to me, this then also it points to, okay, well, what do we do? It's not just about, you know, guarding against the shock. We need to make the forest as wet and verdant as we can, so that the lightning doesn't start.
Need more time, Neil, or should I buy more time for response?
Go ahead, please.
No, no.
No,
Yeah.
no, I was just listening.
Okay. I don't know if there's any other questions. Yeah, yeah.
So I have a partially formal question. I studied anthropology in 2017, 18, since it's sort of where it's coming from. But there was a famous anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, talked about this model of culture that a lot of non-anthropologists have. So he said a lot of people think that there's like a core that's evolutionary biology. Then there's another ring outside that's psychology. Then a third ring around that's culture. So people think that what's at the core is evolutionary biology, and it's maybe psychology, and culture is just like just the cherry on top. But he was saying, you know, as anthropologists, we're studying our culture, and sort of interconnects with all of these various layers. And then the reason I say that is because I guess in your history, you prioritize this kind of human nature, sociobiological, psychological, or it seems to me, because I guess what we're saying is there are patterns in history because there is like a similar human nature that creates like regional production or whatever, like a societal inequality. And I think culture here plays sort of a more functional role that maybe keeps people together or eventually forms different groups. So I was wondering, I guess, do you have any anthropologists sort of complain about the way you are doing your history? And maybe another question might be like, are there any structural blindnesses that are created by doing history this way?
A really, really good question. Everybody complains, anthropologists, historians, evolutionary biologists, everybody complains about us. Less and less now, actually, like at the beginning, it was tough to get people on board. But I think since we've been starting to produce some show that we're not horrible. I would disagree with your assessment. I get what you're saying. Culture is at the absolute heart of it. Like one of our core approaches is cultural evolution. And this is the idea that biological evolution, cultural evolution are not distinct. They are subject to the same types of dynamics and in fact, co-evolve. You know, again, it's not quite human nature, it's repetitive structures that seem to be put in place that lead to miseration, that lead to elite competition and all of these things. And culture is a big part of it, right? It's formal institutions, but it's also the informal norms and behaviors. And these cultures and these norms are subject to the same kind of dynamics, the same kind of pressures, the same kinds of changes and cycles that we see everywhere else. And it is part of this panoply of cycles on cycles on cycles, and all of these forces at different scales. That is diverse and that is dynamic and that is evolved just like anything else. That said, we absolutely have structural blind spots all over the place. I probably don't know what they are by definition. It's my blind spot. We don't get into psychology as much as we ought to. I'm trying to correct that a little bit. That's tricky. It's been harder to integrate like ecological and say non-human life cycles into our work on human societies. We want to, but that's been tricky. I would say those are the blind, some of the blind spots. You know,
Particularly if it's like a sea turtle. Some things move very slow in their evolution.
Yeah.
Like I think what I like about the cultural cycles and innovation cycles is you can. If you go back just a couple hundred years and your cycle's that long, you see the really interesting generational or 20 to 30, 40, 50-year cycles, and you see them go like this and like this and like this. There may be biological things that you can put within a 200-year time span and also see some fashion of an up and down cycle. But I mean, the human brain, maybe there is a big change over 200 years, I'm not sure, but I guess I tend to think of the biological changes as being a lot slower, whereas the generational things, it gives the impression of something where you could start to pinpoint what's going to happen in people's behavior in science and technology and finance, which makes it interesting to me.
I was gonna go back, bouncing off Elena's question and the political aspect of it. When you collab with your collaborators, do you guys use the intra-elite like kind of terminology, like all of those like kind of right? Okay. So I was wondering maybe two things I'm not sure if everyone in the room like has the same familiarity. So I was wondering if you can weave that concept of the elite pump, elite surplus, counter-elite rivalry, and Dan, to give you a real challenge, maybe you can add that in the context, perhaps observationally, going off your article of what we're seeing locally in Canada.
yeah, okay.
Double challenge.
So this is, yeah, if you're familiar, this is again, terminology developed mostly by Jeff Goldstone in the 90s and then formalized by Peter Turchin, and then I've just sort of come on to that bandwagon. Basically, the idea is, and again, I mean, this kind of to your question, this is one of the patterns we see surprisingly everywhere, no matter how historically, how deep we look, every region up to the present, we see this again and again. There's essentially, in this, Peter calls it the wealth pump. The wealth pump is the structures, the institutions, the laws, the norms, the cultures, all the things in a society that generate and distribute wealth. When the wealth pump, and not just wealth, not just material wealth, political access, voice, privileges, and this is where you get to other gender inequalities, you get to disparities among ethnic groups or different cultural groups or whatever type. When the wealth pump is kind of turned on, this is how Peter talks about it, it means that all of these things, the material wealth, money, income, land, access, privilege, flows to the top, a very narrow elite group 1% of the population amasses much more than their fair share. When that happens, and this is the original insight of Jack Goldstone, who's the father of structural demographic theory, which is one of the things that historically seems to explain a lot of the past things. When wealth pump's turned on, you get this, deepening over time, deepening inequality in many different dimensions. A bunch of things happen. Those without, the sort of non-elites, are what we call immiserated. They're left with a smaller and smaller share of the pie. Obviously, this is bad. This is unjust. This creates, declining living standards, declining well-being, declining health, all the bad things. And that's, I think, what everybody knows about that sort of thing all this point. The thing that people don't talk about as much, but is just as corrosive, is even among the elites, even though they are doing well, they are, benefiting from this inequitable systems. They are subject to the same forces because it puts a premium on getting more and more, keeping more and more, holding on to your position, fighting off other people who are coming for those spots as well. Other people, the nouveau riche, they're getting money. They want to, secure a spot in the Senate. They want to secure a spot at the top university. They want their kids to go to the best places. And there's more and more of them. But the number of slots stays the same, right? There's only one president, there's only so many senators, there's only so many spots at Ivy League schools, all these things. The more and more people that want them, then fiercer the competition for them gets. But bigger and bigger the premium of getting more wealth and power and access and cheating and doing whatever you need to win that competition. That historically drives a lot of the competition among elites. We call it intra-elite competition and conflict. A lot of the partisan fighting, a lot of the really sort of extreme radical forms of competition that politics, that society, that economics can take, seems to be driven by this fact of the wealth pie leading to this runaway inequality. And this undermines the functioning of your state. It undermines social stability, people's livelihoods, their outcomes, their well-being, their quality of life is diminished. It's frustrating, it's angry, it's tense. It leads to conflict. A lot of civil wars that we've seen throughout history seem to follow this dynamic. This comes to this sort of common pathway into crisis. This is one of the main drivers of that common pathway. I don't know how much explanation. It seems pretty obvious to me that this characterizes the US, this characterizes Canada. There's empirical documentation for all of these things. This is what I was trying to hint at in this article. There's more to say about it. And if that's true, and if this is a common pathway to extreme social dysfunction and civil violence, then that's really scary. It makes it not surprising that you're seeing the kinds of political violence in the US, but it makes it really scary because it shows that the ground is ripe for spreading. And I have been noticing those kinds of trends in Canada. We can talk about what to do about that, but that's at the sort of root of a lot of what SoDy to try to understand the dynamics of crisis. This is one of the things that comes up again and again and again.
When the pump is turned on, but that's not equal to the word overall abundance, is it? It's a different idea.
It's a different, it's not, this is what makes the idea so powerful, is that it's scale invariant and it's type invariant, so it doesn't matter what type of economy you have. One way or another, this is kind of historical truism. One of the things that societies do is produce goods. Material and social structural goods. Those goods are distributed throughout the society, period. That can be really equitable and great and supply high level of well-being for everybody, or it can be unequal. And the level of inequality is a big spectrum. And so the wealth pump tips it towards the more and more unequal. That's really what it is. And this is why you see, even within a single society, it's not like, oh, this society is unequal, this society is more equal. It's through time it changes as the structures happen, as the wealth pumps accumulates, right? It's a non-linear dynamic because it builds. And the more power you get, the more you can then change the system and turn the wealth up on even more, and then it sort of increases linearly until you reach a connectivity point. And so it's weird, but it's, you see that kind of stuff.
It reminds me of Condor-Teeth waves.
Yeah.
Condor-Teeth waves, there's a spring, a summer, fall and winter. And they last about 30, 40, 50 years, I think.
Yeah.
And at a case spring, what you have is a lot of innovation starting to be produced, starting to flower slowly. In the summer, society, business people, firms, regions, they can take advantage of those innovations and start to make use out of them, useful products, money for lots of people. And then what starts to happen is you get into the fall and then finally into the winter, you start to have a lot of mini recessions. And then what happens in a Condor-Teeth winter, all that starts to kick in is this cycle of trying to mine as much money as you can out of these innovations that are starting to run their course. And remember from my MRP, I was looking at Silicon Valley, and it seemed to be, when I wrote it in 2018-19, Silicon Valley was, and maybe still is, in a K winter, where people are trying to mine all the innovations for more and more, everything is financed heavily. And I think this is related to fewer and fewer people being able to take advantage out of what innovations there are. I mean, maybe you can say that a few years ago, more people in Silicon Valley and in the States were making money off of tech as it was related to the development of apps. Whereas now, if people found that a lot of those apps weren't really useful, AI comes and it just means ever more money for maybe the small number of people that own the AI companies. So it might even be worse than when I wrote my MRP with the advent of AI and the outsized wealth. I mean, there are engineers that are being hired that are 21 years old and are being awarded $250 billion signing bonuses. That's only in the past couple of months, I believe. And there's quite a number of them popping up.
And it's kind of connected right to the production of this of lots of educational or academic spaces. So you better talk quite a bit about that. Maybe you can expand on it.
Yeah.
Try.
Yeah.
You can connect those dots.
Well, I mean, I think that's really well said. It's exactly right. That it is in, deeper K winter. There's a sort of market forces kind of explanation. It is it's the ratios become unbalanced that can drive a lot of the things, and especially because there are different dimensions. There's, the business leaders and the owners and the other people who are making money, and the employees and the other things are happening. And if any one of them gets sort of out of balance, it can create a lot of tensions. And so this is what we see, historically when the wealth bump happens. The sort of classic example is people who amass wealth tend to also want to translate that into political influence. Wealth tends to be more elastic than political positions. So when more and more people get wealthy enough that they think they deserve a seat at the political table, yet the number of chairs remains the same because politics tends to not move as quickly. It's a musical chairs game, right? It's a numbers game. It's the market, your supply and demand is off. And that leaves a lot of upset and frustration. I wrote an article recently about the Taiping Rebellion on the Qing Dynasty, which is led by frustrated scholars who had spent years and years and years studying for the sort of Confucian civil service exams. And there just kept getting more and more of them, and the Qing was expanding, and they were holding all these things, and they were like bringing all of these sort of schools to train these people, and they did not, and the population was growing a ton. Qing's very successful, productive empire. And they just did not expand the number of seats, and so all they were doing is training people and making them spend, go into debt, spend years and years and years and years to get these positions that just did not happen. And people got pissed off, and that's who led the Taiping Rebellion, which is historically, like I said before, human history. That's an education thing. You are kind of seeing those sort of, it's not necessarily gonna be the bloodiest in human history, but similar sorts of dynamics when people talk about, population increase, overall wealth growth. People in terms of absolute numbers, being able to go to college, being able to get bachelors, being able to get masters, being able to get PhDs, the premium on going to a good school, sending your kids to a good school, the rush to do that. That's growing, the number of PhDs is growing. And they're trying to get jobs in industries that are admittedly shrinking. Oh, we don't need it, we're not having cats all over the place. It is a very small number of very highly qualified people who are getting seen chaos. And that number is growing, but it's not growing as fast as the people who are in comp sci programs who are trying to graduate into those roles. That mismatch is rough. I have colleagues who wrote about similar cycles, like in Tunisia and Egypt, and lead up to the Arab Spring revolt. It's that kind of investing in education without accommodating the sort of economic overall structure. So it's just people with education and debt being denied the things they were promised, and that's shitty. Place to be, that's all.
Just want to add this to this point about, like, for example, the education over
It's
production.
really worse, dude. But you.
I guess my
Yeah.
point more is there's a qualitative paradox to this as well,
Yeah.
because you may hollow out the very thing that you're pumping up.
Yeah.
And so the byproduct of what we're experiencing now, for example, is a trust deficit of expertise of people with doctorates and PhDs, et cetera, and a critique of overall the quality of what these institutions,
Yeah.
perhaps the one that we're seated in, included what value do they provide to society. And so it's interesting because it's a double destructive direction.
Yeah, it's really.
Yeah, and so I think that characteristic is common in this analysis.
Yeah.
There's a trust deficit in expertise, but also an impending trust deficit in even what we're looking at as AI. 6 fingers are nearly gone.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a point where it's going to be very difficult to trust anything, and even people that aren't prone to having a lot of distrust all the time, fairly sophisticated people are, people who are nicely centered, psychologically centered, are gonna have difficult talking to people about what the truth is. So even healthy minded people may have a very difficult time in the future. Levels of trust disappearing all over the place.
Yeah. So we've got time, so was your hand up though? Yeah, it's that was a cheap rest. I got it.
I just wanted to ask a little bit more about taking your view of the wealth pump idea. You kind of explained the.
You want in on the wealth pump, eh?
I wanted to say. You mentioned that it keeps recurring, but I think you explained the formation of it and what it looks like, sort of the summer phase. But what are the off ramps, if any? Does it always lead to like maximum tension and then some kind of rupture somewhere, or is there some other off ramp? That was one part of the question. The second is, I think this idea of the wealth pump is not, as far as I know, not very common. It looks like neoliberal economics. Not. Is there some other school of economics or some other way of looking at wealth specifically, not just monetary, but all kinds? That's like well established that includes this idea, or is that just a new thing that's being covered as a pattern that's probably here and stronger than like free market principles?
So there's that question, and then I just want to leave time for yourself after your response to explain, your organization, what you're doing, and then we'll start to wrap up.
I don't know if you've got on if these ideas, if there's a place for these ideas in academia or industry, or did you encounter the wealth pump idea elsewhere?
All I've ever been familiar with, I think, is a thing that most people are familiar with, rise and fall of inequality. Like, I think a lot of people have seen a graph where, you see 1900 and wealth inequality, and then it tapers off in the early 1920s, and it's basically almost flat until the recent decade.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but it's
It's
not,
not
it's
exactly.
not, yeah, it's, cause I mean, this, the end, it's hard to say, this is what I was wondering, it's. Like the idea of inequality being a thing, being a bad thing, that's very common in many disciplines. And maybe not mainstream economics, but in political science, certainly, and that's a huge indicator, sociology. But the specific aspect of the wealth pump and those forces that drive it, and especially, I think, the intra-elite competition aspect, like that's what I don't find. There's still the idea that, oh, well, the elite, obviously they have the same incentives, and therefore they're a cohesive cooperative group. And that is, could not be further from the truth. Historically, we can show that all over the place. And I think that's an important thing. Just because that you need that to explain what's going on, like why partisanship, why such harsh sectarian, like, okay, well, this is why, like,
Well,
it's natural.
has a lot of, a big psychological aspect.
Yeah,
And like Elliott waves have a psychology to them, but that's really just based on.
Yeah.
When and why people would want to invest, and so there's a little bit of psychology there, but this is much more societal and cultural and. If it goes wrong, if it starts to, finish the property.
well, if it goes wrong, and it often does, it's really shitty. So I was thinking that, it's a really good point. It's not a psychology like Jack Goldstone, who sort of. Generated the first sort of ideas and wrote about intra-elite competition. He's not a psychologist by any means, but it is a psychological thing because it's really about that, your perception of what you've done, what you deserve, what you require for a good life, and the mismatch with your reality, and that's the driver of frustration and dysfunction. Yet psychology doesn't pick it up. I would say ecological economics is the best place for it, just the framework of the finite world, finite resources. They are very much concerned with mismatches between ratios and between, growth in one area, coming up against the limit. Or inelasticity in another area like that. Their framework is really well compatible. The quick answer to your other question. There's way fewer examples of the wealth pump being turned off peacefully and sustainably than I would like. This averted crisis article is, that's what we're trying to show. There was minimal violence and it did effectively turn off the wealth pump for at least a segment of the population. It's not perfect, but meaningful, observable, empirical leveling off of that in a couple of places. Most of the time what happens is there's literally, it's just violence and the numbers recede. So one elite group wins out, they kill off the other competitors, people leave, the numbers get reset. So now, even without significant structural change, the wealth pump is still on, but the numbers, the ratios are a little bit more back in balance, right? So you've reset the stage, you figured out, okay, well, these are the elites, they're the ones who have access to all the privileges, okay, fine. There's enough for it to go around, they're not at each other's throats. You've done some hand wavy redistribution, you've killed a lot of the non-elites, so now there's enough for them to go around, their lives seem okay. But the structure hasn't changed, so this is where you get the cycles. Because the wealth pump's still on, and the ratios are, less dramatic, but it's just gonna build up again, and it's gonna take a couple of generations, and so you're gonna get a 40 to 50 year cycle.
It's interesting how it's also related to science, or I'm interested in lately, the study of status and envy,
Yes.
societal ideas of status feelings.
Yeah.
And feelings of envy.
Yeah.
It's not just, it's a very personal thing for sure, for most of us. We experience them, but to see maybe waves of cultural, societal feelings of status and envy would be pretty interesting
Exactly.
too.
And this brings up the culture, what is valued can shift a little bit, but there's always something societally that is valued, that is status, that is signs of privilege. And if you want and think you deserve access to it and you don't have it, again, that's a psychological, there's a science of what that is psychologically that does to you, the anger, the frustration, the willingness to commit violence against people who, yesterday you saw as your neighbor and compatriot. Like that's the thing. There's a sort of still more psychology to be fleshed out. That's a whole topic. We're getting to that. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question. And lastly, so this is what SoDy is, SoDy Cell Dynamics, so-dy.org. The website is, we're in the process of updating it, so give us a couple of days. Basically, what we are is, because academics, for a legitimate reason, are trained against and not interested in engaging in explicit discussions about policy, about interventions. Okay, we can diagnose these cycles. We don't tell you what to do with it. That's not our job. That's the politician's job. I was frustrated a little bit with that. So SoDy is really just a platform to take our historical insights, take our methods from grid dynamics, from Seshat, and to bring it to bear on our modern political crisis. That's our whole mission. Whatever that means, we're still figuring it out. If you have ideas, let me know. We're young, we're new, but it is exciting to think that, it's not just academic, if I can put it that way. We are trying to be part of larger conversations. And I feel like a lot of you in this room have that sort of vibe, and that's why I was really excited to come here and join this conversation. Cool. Strategic foresight, thinking through complex systems in a way that is meaningful and helps people in their actual lives to deal with that. And it's really exciting to be.
What do you hope for in terms of the organized formation or the type of interactions? Like, what's on the horizon? What do you think of?
So we have a couple of collaborations on the horizon. What we're trying to get to is hook up with people who actually have the ear of politicians, who are on the ground. So I'm talking to people at this organization that works with municipalities all over the world, and this one person who has contacts in certain cities in Brazil and Colombia, with mayors who are very receptive to ideas about the political crisis. And it's okay. Let's join a conversation where we think through what would it mean to have progressive, sustainable kinds of reforms. What would it mean to turn down the wealth pump in Sao Paulo, basically?
Interesting.
That would be fantastic.
Right.
And things like that. Love to get the ear of Canadian politicians. I've had a few conversations with some ministers. They're polite and friendly, but then it doesn't go anywhere. Trying to figure out what to do here. Would love to have continuing conversations with folks in this room about that.
I think we owe you a response to your earlier question, because you were asking us about, foresight and things like that. And if I misrepresent foresight for the SFI in the room, those are eggs at me, I'll give you eggs, throw at me later. Like a lot of what I think, SFI or strategic foresight could benefit from, they're often they take a lot of these from like different ideas of scenario planning and three horizons, etc. And there is a way in which we may be thinking, as Robert was pointing out, there's contention between, are we idealizing certain futures? Is the preferred futures the way to go? And what we might lack that your community has, and this is where there could be a positive symbiosis, is a more methodological rigor in how to truly understand the cycle that you're within or that is preceding. And I don't think the foresight community has that. Is that fair or not fair?
I think it depends maybe who.
Yeah, I guess it's why.
What level you're at. I think.
Yeah.
So it's being recorded. Specifically for this program and people who do SFI here, tell me if you disagree. It is a design school and it is definitely employing and putting emphasis a lot on design aspects and maybe a lot more hopeful versions of the futures, but it doesn't necessarily get, at least within the program, doesn't necessarily get to rigor and methodologies that I think are required for the foresight and policy making. I think that's
the connection point. Not just SFI, it could be the foresight and futures profession at large, right?
Yes, but I have also seen the other side of the foresight where, and this is how I got introduced to some of the things, where there's a lot of more emphasis on methodologies and rigor and understanding the past, and actually quantifying. And I think we sometimes seem to really be we as a futurists, younger version of the future, seem to be really fan of not quantifying or giving answers, which to me, and I'm on my own journey, but foresight and futures thinking did come from military spaces. And I know sometimes says it doesn't, I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, so we talk about decolonization of futures, I think we should be talking about demilitarization of futures, because futures think tanks in Europe were funded by CIA. Right, like, so there are a lot of those connections, I think we're just seem to be sometimes drifting away from the idea of we need to go back to having a rigor, methodology and quantification where we can, and then maybe those horizons become less hope, not hopeful, less feel less unattainable.
Yeah, that's really, so,
I do disagree, sorry.
yeah, well, just really quickly on that, just to say that, I mean, that's such an amazing point, and, I think this speaks to your comment about, it's one thing for billionaires to have access to the science, it's another thing to sort of, have it to everyone, and I think that decolonizing, demilitarizing this science is super important. I have some colleagues who have worked at the Rand Corp for a while, and they have this whole methodology that they've developed specifically for complex computational quantitative forecasting that embraces uncertainty, which is not the norm, but that's what you need. It's not one future, it's not one thing, it's not one answer. It's probabilistic, it's uncertainty, but it's not infinite uncertainty. I think that's maybe where the rub is. It's not everything, but it's also not one thing. It's some things, and there's probability, and there's ranges, and there's ways to do that. And there's ways to integrate quantitative and qualitative, and that's what at SoDy we're really trying to do, because it's neither one on their own has the answers. It needs to be a conversation between the method. I think this is kind of where you get, so it's really exciting that these methods are there, they're being developed. There's young people who seem enthusiastic about them, and so it's
Young.
younger than you.
Like the cycles of innovation, there may be a lot of dates and numbers and, spring, summer, winter, fall, et cetera, quantitative, but in my study, when you add in three horizons, when I see a three horizons framework, I don't see a timeline associated with it. It doesn't have numbers, so you can mix, the qualitative in with the quantitative.
And just, it's okay if students are practicing, and that's fine, for the purposes of like learning the skills, but I think when it goes to actual application, there is this misunderstanding of really a sense of time. And I think that's the biggest piece to impart for maybe a design strategy led background is to really immerse yourself in that. I think your community does that quite intensely. But maybe just a final point on these series when we wrap up, I go back to the title question of this session, and I don't know who to put on the spot first, but either one can do. So maybe you just have a 2-minute or one, just a final thought on what, in your experience and observations, can systems thinkers learn from this idea of quantifying history?
Honestly, I think it's more the other way around. It's what have we learned from systems thinkers and complexity science, and it's the core of our work is based on these ideas and these pathways. And I guess the main thing that I would leave with is that it has to be a conversation, and it has to be a conversation with as many people as possible, with as many different perspectives and backgrounds. But I mean, we keep coming to it has to be multiple ideas and multiple dimensions, and it has to be different approaches, and it's about blending and integrating. I think that's where in the community of science and practice and foresight and politics in general, that's where we're at. We've done enough of the silo stuff, everyone knows that. It's about the blending. I think especially for the younger-ish people, don't specialize too quickly in science. That's the main takeaway if you take anything.
Cool. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, you're right that systems thinking has allowed things like studying cycles of history, but also different kind of frameworks that you could bring to say geographical centers of innovation, because Canada, US, all countries, they have their regions that they want to keep healthy. They don't want them to, they want them to flourish, not to decline. And to that, there's all kinds of great systems, frameworks and systems thinking that allows this kind of study to happen. I was thinking about, there's a couple people in this room who are interested in ancient Rome. And I was watching a quick interview. The person was interviewing Mary Beard, who wrote a really popular history of Rome. What's the acronym for Rome?
SPQR.
SPQR. That was kind of like the first trademark ever. The sign Rome was here, stamped on an object, stamped on a building. Anyway, the interviewer was asking her, you know, a lot of people seem to want to, in different eras of history, Victorian era, the 1920s, now, they want to say, are we like Rome right now? Are we like the fall of Rome right now? Are we as good as Rome right now? Wasn't Rome wonderful? Weren't the rulers wonderful? Were they despots on the other hand? And they were talking about, first she said it depends who you are and what you think of what rulers should be. So they were talking a little bit about how you could learn from a very important era. And this is going much farther back than the cycles of innovation that go only as far back as 200 years. Rome's about 2000 years. But she basically said in the end that you study history because there's very little else to study to figure out what might happen. And very simple, but it wasn't her quote. She was saying she was attending a lecture somewhere else, and the person giving the lecture said, "You're not going to get it from anywhere else." And she found that pretty novel as a historian.
Nice. Yeah, so
Miller might say we're still really obsessed with monumentalism and imperialism. We can't seem to let that idea go, and that's why we keep talking about Rome and whether or not Rome was good or anything of that sort.
yeah. Yeah, even the verdict on the French Revolution is still out, right? Like we've heard that saying as well. Yeah. But yeah, a great way to end it. So thank you, Neil. Thank you, Dan, for a wonderful conversation. We usually continue the conversation just at a place nearby for like some food or for some drinks. I'm jet lagged, I might join a little bit. But David, I don't know if you have any ideas of what.
Probably German kebab shop, German.
Kebab shop, okay.
Yeah.
That seems to be. And then the final note for next month, we're on different days this semester. So next month we overlap with RSD. So relating systems thinking and design conference, by the way, you should have on your radar. I'll mention that.
Yeah.
A little bit more. And so it's Thursday, October 9th, and we're gonna have Greg Van Alstyne talk about the S Lab and the cyclical history of the S Lab, maybe. And which was a social innovation lab here at OCAD, and some of his ideas about giving that some renewal as well. Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
I wonder what an owl was.
Yeah, we all hope with that. Is that